I didn't plan to crash at my friend's place tonight. The repair shop had kept me later than usual, lights buzzing, wrenches clanging, that familiar smell of oil and metal. But somehow, when I stepped inside the apartment building, I realized I had no real excuse not to accept his invitation. Small comfort, warmth, somewhere to sit beside my own restless thoughts. The door was ajar when I arrived, and that's when I saw her. Slowly, deliberately, she stepped into the hallway, and the air seemed to shift without a sound. She didn't greet me first. She didn't have to. I already knew her, at least enough to recognize the quiet authority in her posture, the way her shoulders held herself even when she moved casually in slippers, like the space around her belonged to her. Her hair caught the dim light in hints of copper and gray. Her eyes, sharp and soft at the same time, scanned the apartment before landing on me. And then she said it. "I missed you tonight." Her voice was low, intimate in a way that shouldn't have been meant for me. I froze. Something inside me jumped, the kind of flutter that doesn't announce itself, just reverberates in the chest like a misplaced chord. I couldn't place it. Did she really mean it? Or was it a polite half-joke meant for my friend? My throat went dry, and I caught myself fumbling with the strap of my bag. She smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that fills a room. It was measured, knowing, like she understood something about me that I hadn't even admitted to myself. She moved closer, not too close, and leaned against the doorframe with one hip, arms crossed loosely. A stray lock of hair fell across her face, and I realized I was staring. And then she tilted her head, just slightly, as if reading me like an open page. "I made coffee," she said finally, breaking the silence, but it felt incidental. I followed her into the kitchen, noting the way her hands moved, efficient, confident, but with a softness I wouldn't have expected. She poured the coffee without spilling a drop, sliding a mug across the counter toward me. Our fingers brushed. Quick, almost nothing. But my pulse jumped anyway, the kind of small, ridiculous electricity that makes you feel alive in a way you weren't expecting. I wanted to say something clever, something to make her laugh, something that would make this moment less charged, less inexplicable. But the words stuck, caught somewhere in my throat. Instead, I just nodded and muttered a quiet, "Thanks," feeling the awkwardness stretch thin between us like a wire. We stood there, coffee warming our hands, and I watched her for a while. She was reading the lines on the counter, apparently distracted, yet I knew she was aware of me, aware of the way I'd frozen the second she walked in. The air was quiet, but I felt it thick around us. Every small gesture, every glance, seemed amplified. And for a moment, I imagined that the world had narrowed down to that kitchen, to the soft hum of the fridge, the steam rising from our mugs, and her near-imperceptible exhale when she caught my eye again. I left her apartment that night with the scent of coffee still clinging to my clothes, with her smile, her voice, her presence echoing in my chest. I kept replaying the words over and over. "I missed you tonight." And I couldn't stop thinking about what she meant. I found myself back at her apartment 2 nights later, carrying a box of books my friend had forgotten at the repair shop. She was already there, perched on the edge of the sofa with her laptop open, a quiet frown tugging at her forehead. The room smelled faintly of vanilla and old paper, like a bookstore trapped in sunlight. "Thanks," she said, not looking up, voice clipped but polite. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, then tapped out a pause, as if weighing whether to engage further. I set the box down carefully, noting the way she flinched slightly at the scrape of cardboard against the table. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words tangled in my chest. So I just crouched and started sorting through the books, letting her presence fill the room. She glanced at me from time to time, eyes briefly softening, then pulling back like a tide retreating from the shore. At one point, she rubbed her temples with both hands, eyes closed, and let out a low sigh. I caught a glimpse of a silver ring on her finger, delicate, worn, and familiar somehow. Her hands were strong, practiced, but they trembled just slightly when she stretched them. I noticed, and my stomach tightened. "Rough day?" I asked quietly. She hesitated. Then, for a moment, her gaze lingered, raw and unguarded, before she turned back to the screen. You could say that, she murmured, voice softer than before. Her shoulders slumped almost imperceptibly, like she'd been holding something up that finally weighed enough to bend her. I wanted to reach out, to tell her it was okay to let go, but I didn't. I stayed low, sorting the books, pretending my hands were busy, but stealing glances at her anyway. I noticed how she laughed quietly at a line on her screen, a half-smile that flickered then vanished as quickly as it came. I noticed the way she tensed when I moved past her, just slightly, and the faint scent of jasmine she wore. We worked side by side for a while in silence, the quiet punctuated only by the rustle of pages and the occasional click of keys. Each small gesture, each glance, carried more weight than any words could. I felt an unfamiliar ache, wanting to understand her fully but knowing she might never let me. Then, as I handed her a stack of books, our fingers brushed again, longer this time, almost by accident. She looked up, and our eyes met. No words, just the faint electricity of two people close enough to feel the pull, but careful enough not to cross the line. She smiled, small and guarded, almost as if acknowledging the moment without admitting what it meant. And for some reason, I couldn't look away. The space between us throbbed quietly, carrying a charge I wasn't supposed to feel but couldn't ignore. I left that night with the image of her tired eyes and tentative smile pressed into my mind, lingering longer than any coffee scent ever could. The rain had started softly, then picked up, drumming against the apartment windows like a private percussion just for us. I hadn't meant to stay, but the storm made leaving impossible, or maybe I didn't want to leave. She was in the kitchen, humming quietly as she stirred something in a pan, and I leaned against the counter behind her, pretending to check my phone while stealing glances. Her hair was damp from a quick walk to the mailbox, and she kept tucking stray strands behind her ears. I noticed the faint crease between her brows when she concentrated, the tiny twitch of her jaw when she laughed at a memory I couldn't hear. "You always seem to be here when I'm cooking," she said lightly, without looking at me. But I heard it. Her tone carried something else, a slight warmth I wasn't supposed to parse. I wanted to say something stupid, like, "I like being here," but I didn't. Instead, I stepped closer under the pretense of clearing a spot on the counter. Our shoulders brushed. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed down to that tiny space, the steam from the pan curling around us, her scent soft and familiar. My hands twitched. I thought about reaching out. Not to touch, really, but to connect. Then her phone buzzed. She glanced at it and stiffened. I saw a name flash across the screen. Her ex. She sighed, muttered something about work, and the moment evaporated. I retreated subtly, letting the space reopen between us. She didn't notice, or maybe she did and chose not to. Later, we sat at the tiny kitchen table, rain streaking the window beside us. I was half eating a plate she'd made, mostly distracted by the way her fingers traced the rim of her mug. I wanted to ask her if she ever felt lonely, or if she ever wondered what it would be like to let someone in. But I couldn't. I kept my mouth shut, pretending to chew, pretending I wasn't holding my own breath. At one point, I laughed at a joke she made. Too loud, too eager, and she caught my gaze. Her eyes lingered longer than necessary, and then, almost imperceptibly, she leaned closer, brushing my arm with hers. It wasn't accidental. I knew that. I felt a sudden pull in my chest, the kind that warns you something is dangerous and irresistible at the same time. I imagined it, leaning forward, closing the small space between us, letting the rain outside drown out the world, letting her know what I'd been thinking all along. I almost did it. My lips, my hands, my whole body knew what it wanted. But the storm outside, her phone buzzing again, the sound of a neighbor's door slamming, life intruded. I stayed still. She straightened, her smile a little more guarded, and I told myself it was for the best. Still, when I left that night, soaked from the rain I couldn't avoid, I replayed the moment endlessly. How close we had been, how close I had come, how it had stopped, impossibly, just short of confession. We hadn't planned to talk about it, but the apartment seemed to insist. The air was heavy, thick with unspoken words, and I found myself perched on the edge of the sofa, hands gripping my knees, unable to look away from her. She sat opposite me, cross-legged, the dim light from the lamp casting soft shadows across her face. "You're different when you're here," she said finally, voice low, uncertain, like she was testing the words before releasing them. She glanced at the floor, then back at me, eyes sharp yet searching. "I don't know what I'm doing." Her honesty hit me like cold water. I wanted to speak, to say something clever, something that would ease the tension, but no words came. I realized I'd been holding my breath, waiting for her to define the feeling I couldn't name myself. "I mean," she continued, her voice trembling slightly, "we act like this is normal, like you just drop in and we laugh, we talk. But it isn't normal, is it?" She looked at me now, really looked, and I saw a vulnerability there that she rarely allowed anyone to see. Her hands were folded loosely in her lap, but they shook slightly, betraying the calm she tried to maintain. I swallowed, unsure how to answer. Part of me wanted to confess everything, to admit how often I thought about her, how every glance, every laugh, every accidental brush of her hand had become a kind of quiet obsession. But the other part of me knew it wasn't my place yet. So I stayed quiet, letting the words settle between us, letting her voice fill the room like an ache. She sighed, a slow, heavy sound, and leaned back, staring at the ceiling as if the answer might be written there. "I don't want to hurt anyone," she murmured, almost to herself. "I don't even know if I can handle whatever this is." The silence stretched. I noticed the faint tension in her shoulders, the way her lips pressed together when she wasn't speaking, the restless shift of her foot against the carpet. I wanted to reach for her hand, but I didn't. That small act would have said more than any words. Finally, she turned toward me again, eyes glistening. "I'm scared," she whispered. "Scared that we're making something happen that we can't stop." Her voice cracked, almost a sigh, almost a plea, and I felt the room shrink around us. I wanted to argue, to reassure her, to promise that it could be harmless. But the truth was I couldn't. Not without lying. Not when I had spent every quiet hour thinking about her, watching her, noticing the little things she didn't know anyone saw. She lowered her gaze, and the silence swallowed us whole. The kind of silence that isn't empty. It's full, thick, electric, and unbearable. And then she said it, the words that lodged in my chest and refused to leave. "I don't even know who I am when you're here." I didn't expect her to talk about it. Not here, not now, with the rain still tapping softly against the windows, with the apartment smelling faintly of the coffee she'd left cooling on the counter. But she leaned back in her chair, hands folded loosely in her lap, and stared at the floor like she was seeing something buried in the wood. "I haven't told anyone this in years," she said quietly. Her voice wavered just enough to make me stop breathing. "My husband, he left. Just like that. No warning. And I thought I was done with feeling like that, you know." She glanced at me, eyes raw and luminous. "But sometimes, even now, I wake up and..." Her voice caught, and she swallowed hard. "I feel the same ache. Like I'm not enough." I wanted to say something, anything, but the right words didn't exist. Instead, I remembered the old photo I had seen months ago when she'd mentioned her family. The one of her with her husband, smiling in sunlight that didn't exist anymore. I could see her in that frame, bright, warm, whole, and now here she was, fragile in a way she almost never allowed. I didn't know," I whispered, because it felt too small to be anything else. But I watched her relax, or maybe tense less, at the acknowledgement. There was no pity in my voice, only recognition. Recognition that she had carried this weight alone for too long. She shook her head slowly, as if to rid herself of the thought. "I shouldn't be talking about this. I shouldn't," but she didn't finish. Her hands fidgeted for a moment, brushing against the mug beside her. And in that tiny movement, in the way her fingers lingered, I felt the world tilt slightly. I wanted to reach for her hand, to offer it as a lifeline, but I stopped myself. She wasn't ready, and I wasn't sure if I ever would be ready to cross that line. So instead, I let silence stretch between us, a quiet companion that somehow carried understanding, empathy, and the unspoken thread pulling us closer. Then, As if sensing my hesitation, she leaned forward, resting her forehead briefly against her palm. Her voice was almost a whisper. I don't know if anyone could ever understand this side of me, or if I'd even let them. And in that moment, something shifted. Not drastically, not dramatically, but subtly, internally seismic. The kind of shift that changes the way you notice someone forever. I realized I was no longer just visiting, observing, or passing time. I was being pulled into her world, into the space she had tried so hard to shield, and I couldn't resist. When I finally stood to leave, she didn't ask me to go. She didn't say anything at all. But as I crossed the room, our eyes met, and the quiet understanding hung there. Fragile, powerful, and terrifying. A storm inside both of us, waiting for the right moment to speak. I found myself sitting on the edge of her sofa again, this time without excuses or deliveries. The apartment felt familiar, warm in the dim evening light, and I could hear her moving softly in the kitchen, humming the same tune she had before. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. She knew I was here, and somehow, that was enough. When she emerged, she carried 2 mugs of tea, fumbling slightly with the steam rising between us. Her eyes met mine, and for the first time, there was no hesitation, no guarded glance, just acknowledgement. She handed me a mug, and our fingers brushed, lightly, almost shyly, but the touch lingered in a way neither of us broke. We sat in the living room, side by side but not touching, yet the silence was heavy with understanding. I noticed the way her shoulders relaxed, the small smile playing at the corner of her lips, the faint scent of jasmine still clinging to her hair. And I realized I was no longer observing her from the outside. I was part of this quiet world she had let me in on, and I didn't want to leave. I never thought it would feel like this again, she said finally, voice low and even, but layered with something I couldn't name. She looked at her hands wrapped around the mug, then back at me. I've been careful, too careful, but you make it hard. I didn't answer with words. I didn't need to. I reached out slowly, resting my fingers against hers on the mug. She didn't pull away. Our touch was tentative, yet firm in its own small way. The weight of unspoken truths, the years of past heartbreak, the quiet obsession, and longing, all of it condensed into that single, fleeting contact. We stayed like that for a long while, sitting together, letting the room hold us. There was no rush, no confession, no labels, just the recognition of something earned, fragile, and inevitable. The storm outside had passed, but inside, the air seemed charged with the intimacy of shared presence. Finally, she leaned slightly closer, not enough to cross the line, but enough that our knees brushed. Her hair brushed my shoulder as she shifted, and I felt a warmth that went beyond the tea or the room. We didn't need to speak. We didn't need to define anything. We were simply there, and that was enough. The world outside could wait. Our pasts, our fears, our hesitations, they were here but secondary, acknowledged yet held lightly. We had reached a point where pretending was impossible, where the quiet acceptance of each other's presence said everything that words never could. And when I finally stood to leave, she didn't follow. She didn't call me back, but I caught the small, almost imperceptible squeeze of her hand on the mug before I walked away. That single gesture stayed with me, long after the door clicked shut. Quiet, understated, but final in a way that made the truth undeniable. We were here, together, whether we admitted it or not. Looking back, it's strange how small moments define the rest of your life. I can still feel the warmth of her apartment, the quiet hum of the city outside, and the way her hand brushed mine over a mug of tea, soft, fleeting, yet weighted with everything we didn't say. That night, we didn't declare love, we didn't make promises. But we didn't need to. She taught me something I hadn't expected. That connection isn't always loud or dramatic. It can exist in silence, in a shared glance, in the patience to wait for the other to arrive at the same truth. I learned to watch, to notice, to respect her boundaries while still feeling everything she allowed me to witness. I learned that desire can be gentle and quiet and still real. She changed, too. There was a shift in her posture, a loosened tension in her shoulders, a softness in her voice, when she spoke. She didn't stop guarding herself completely, she never would, but she let me in far enough to see the woman behind the careful composure. That was all we needed. To exist in the same space, to be seen, understood, and accepted without forcing labels. I think that's what love really is: messy, imperfect, and quiet. It's not always the confessions or the fireworks. Sometimes it's the afterglow, the lingering warmth, the knowledge that someone knows you fully and still chooses to stay. That realization has stayed with me, lingering in unexpected moments. The smell of coffee, the hush of a storm, the brush of a stranger's hand against yours that somehow feels familiar. I've carried her presence with me in a way that isn't obsessive or overwhelming. It's steady, comforting, like a memory that teaches you patience and hope. And every time I think of her, I remember that small touch on the mug, the fleeting smile, the quiet acknowledgement that we had crossed a line into something real, something earned, something human. So here we are, still imperfect, still cautious, still learning, but undeniably connected. And that's enough. Enough to make all the awkward pauses, the hesitations, the unspoken words worth it. Enough to remind me that love doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers, and if you're lucky, you listen. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?